Well, hi there, and welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Real Estate Investing. I'm your host, Sharon Vornholt, and I'm so happy you're joining us today. My guest today is Bill Walston, and we are going to talk about something that I believe will be critical to your success. I'm going to do that. I'm going to cut this out. My guest today is Bill Walston, and we're going to talk about something. You know what, Bill? Let me just start all over. I'm going to cut the whole front off.
Okay, that's fine.
Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, just start the whole recording over
Yeah.
and you'll start a new one.
Yeah. I'll just clip this out. Okay, let's do this again. Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Real Estate Investing. I'm your host, Sharon Vornholt, and I'm so happy you're joining us today. My guest today is Bill Walston, and we are going to talk about something I believe will be critical to your success in this upcoming 12 to 18 months, and that is understanding creative financing and how to use it in your business. Bill Walston is one of the most sought after business and tax strategists in the real estate investing community. His passion is teaching and creating strategies that help real estate investors do more deals, make more money, and live a tax deductible life. Bill holds an undergraduate degree in accounting and finance and a graduate degree in tax and law. He lives in the beautiful mountains of Tennessee with his two fur kids, Bailey and Karma. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Hi, Sharon. How you doing? It's great to be back.
I'm good. So I know that we're going to talk about your fur kids always, but I'm always
we do.
Always talk about the fur kids. So let's tell everybody a little bit about your background. I think people that are familiar with you are going to know this, but for those of folks that don't know how you got started, you have a pretty interesting story.
Yeah, and thank you for the lovely introduction. I've now got to live up to that. So, all right. So, as you said, my undergraduate degree is in accounting and finance. My graduate degree is in tax law, and I started my own accounting firm years and years ago, more years than I would like to say. It was kind of interesting. My initial clients ended up being real estate investors and real estate agents for some strange reason. I guess it was just fortuitous. And it didn't take very long for me to see that the profits were on the other side of the desk in real estate. And I sold my practice out to my partner and started investing in real estate, thinking that the tax stuff was all behind me. Little did I know I still had people who wanted help with tax stuff. So I've been able to combine those two passions and help real estate investors with entity structure, creative deal structure, tax savings, that type of thing. So it's been, really good over this last over 3 decades of investing.
Well, I know that one of your levels of expertise has to do with creative financing. And I really believe that coming off of this whole COVID experience, creative financing strategies are going to be so important. So I wanted to focus in on that today. So first of all, for anyone that might not know what it is, what the heck is creative finance strategies?
Creative financing strategies is a little different, means different things to different people. I think most of the time when we hear creative financing, we think of owner financing. I mean, that's everybody's go-to definition, which is basically whenever the owner of the property carries back some of the note or allows themselves to take a second mortgage or even structure the whole thing with a seller note. That's what a lot of people think of as creative financing. I consider it to be anything other than a traditional buy. And by traditional buy, I mean you have a 20% down payment and an 80% note. And you've saved and saved and saved and stayed and come up with that 20% down payment or whatever the down payment amount is, right, out of your own pocket. And that just does not fly for me. Okay. I think creative financing is anything other than that. So there are a lot of different strategies, but let's say that you have the seller take back a second and you get institutional financing. That's a creative strategy, right? So there are different types of strategies for that, but I go a little further than just the owner finance part of creative finance.
Yeah, I know that you have You have a hierarchy of the way you like to do things, which I thought was interesting. I never really thought of it that way until you pointed it out. But you have an order in which you like to do things if you're buying, and that is quite different than if you are selling. So I would go so far as to say it's more advantageous to you to do it this way.
Sure.
So let's dive into the buy side of this.
Okay. My hierarchy, and by that I mean this is the way I like to start off with my deals. This is the order in which I start looking at structure, and I can't always stop at the start at the very top. Okay, but that's where my go-to is, and then I'll work my way down that hierarchy, adding as I need to, or taking away, or doing a little bit of different structures. So of course, you and I've chatted about this forever, right? My favorite type of deal is a subject to deal, where I am able to go in and just take over the property for the underlying loan. And that was really, really popular years and years ago when I first started, because the prime interest rate when I first started investing was 21%. And we just did not want to go to the bank and borrow money. So we tried to do those sub-2 type deals. And then in 2008, 2009, 2010, when everything went to hell in a handbasket, right, there were a lot of subject to deals then because of foreclosures and people couldn't sell their properties. Properties were underwater and weren't even worth what the underlying loan was, right? So it was very easy to get those type of deals. As the market improved over the years, it was not going to say very difficult, it was more unusual or rare to be able to find someone who would do a straight sub-2. Now, they would do a straight sub-2 with something I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes, right? But they didn't want to walk away from any equity, so they wouldn't let it be a complete trade. You couldn't get the deed for just the loan amount, right? And that's what a sub-2 deal is being able to pick up that deed for just the underlying loan. You are not assuming the loan. And a lot of people think, oh, I'm just going to assume that underlying loan. That's not what we do. We simply take up the payments on that underlying loan. Okay, so that's my first go-to, is the sub-2.
Yeah, and one thing I want to point out here is that you need to do this in an ethical manner. It's not fair to take over the payments on someone's property. They give you the deed with the understanding that you're going to make those payments and not trash their credit. So that is a big thing from a moral and ethical standpoint, I believe.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I will tell you what too, Sharon, that sometimes what we will do, and a lot of people don't consider this to be a straight subject to, but if there is any concern with the seller who says, well, I don't know whether you're going to make my payments or not, or with the seller saying, I want to buy another house type thing, right? And that's always the thing. If you're just taking over the payments and that mortgage stays in their name, then there's a concern about whether they're going to be able to get another mortgage. So we will sometimes do what we call a mirror mortgage. And this kind of goes back down one level of my hierarchy, right? Because what it involves is we will actually give the seller a note or a mortgage for the same amount as the underlying mortgage and with the same terms, right? So when we make our payment to the seller on the note that we gave him, he of course pays the underlying loan using that, and they just offset each other. Okay, but what he is able to do is, number one, it takes care of the security factor, because if we don't make the payments, then he can foreclose on the property and get his property back, right? So he doesn't have that concern. And it also gives him a note to show to his lender when he wants to buy new property that mortgage, even though it is still in his name, it's wrapped under another mortgage that's offsetting those payments.
So that's where the term wrap mortgage comes from.
That's kind of where that wrap mortgage term comes from. But I think, and I totally agree with you, that a sub-2, you take on a lot of responsibility with that. it's very, very important that you make those underlying payments. And, we didn't worry about it as much years and years ago. Most investors would come in and you didn't even worry about them making the payments. They just did it, right? And over the years, some of that's just kind of disappeared. There were people who were coming in and taking property subject to getting the deed and then just trotting off and never making any of the underlying payments. And that's horrible. That is the worst possible thing that can happen. So you have to consider that. Yeah, you have to be very, very ethical as an investor.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. So let's talk about contract for deed.
Okay. A contract for deed is simply, we sometimes call it an agreement for deed. Okay. It's in some states, it's called a bond for title. So it goes by a lot of different names. In some states, it's called an installment land contract. I think you probably heard of that. It goes by many, many names. Essentially, what that is you are getting the equitable interest in the property, the legal title to the property. Let's say I'm buying a property from you, Sharon, using a contract for deed. Okay. You turn the property over to me. In all respects, I own that property as far as anybody's concerned. I'm responsible for the maintenance. I'm responsible for taxes. I'm responsible for any upkeep, etc. Okay. So I have equitable interest in that property. I can transfer it if I want to. I can do anything I want to pretty much with that property, but I don't have legal title to that property yet. That still stays with you. Okay. So if anybody looks on public records, they will find a agreement for deed on file in my name, right? But then if they go look for the name on the deed, that's still going to be your name on the deed. That kind of gets an answer to the seller who says, well, I don't want to give you the deed until the property's paid for. I don't want to give you the deed until the underlying mortgage is paid for. That's why I say I just move right down to my next buying hierarchy and say, okay, if you don't want to take a mortgage or you don't want to give me subject to, what if, I take over the property, I make all the payments, I'm responsible for everything, but the deed stays in your name until the property is paid for. Okay. And that would be done with a contract for deed. And that's sometimes just a level of comfort for the seller, right? Now you have to be careful. In some states, it gets a little confusing, right? Because depending on what state you live in, if I didn't make the payments and you, as the legal owner of the property, wanted to get me out, in some states you could just evict me. Okay, just like I was a tenant. In other states, you would have to foreclose on me, okay, just as though it were a mortgage. So you kind of want to know what the rules and regs are in your particular state for that, okay? But it's a very, very creative way of buying a property. And what's interesting, it hasn't been used with single family homes as long as it has been with not rental, but investment properties, right? In the investment world, people have used it for years and years and know exactly what you're talking about. Okay.
Exactly.
So it's just in the last few years, well, maybe not the last few, last few decades, maybe, that people with single family homes have started using that strategy. But they used to use it for apartments and other types of things like that. So it's very, very common on the commercial side, not so much on the single family side. So, you'd want your contracts drawn up by an attorney or have them renewed by somebody who kind of knew what they were doing with that.
Yeah, the only one of those, I did one of those early on. It was a rehab, and it kept me from going to the bank for financing. The terms were favorable, and it worked out very well for me. And the investor that I bought the property from, he knew that he would get back a fixed up property if for any reason I didn't perform on the note. But we had I can't even remember now, maybe a five year balloon. 5-year balloon. Yeah. And then I refied. Well, actually, I kept that property for a rental property. So that, yes, but at some point I had to refi out of it.
Right.
And then just got permanent financing.
Yeah. And that's a nice thing. And that's a creative strategy as well, Sharon, because once you have the contract for deed, since you are considered to have equitable interest in the property, when you get ready to get permanent financing on that property or pay your seller off or whatever, you'll be doing a refinance on that property, not a purchase money mortgage, right? So you a lot of times do not have to come up with a down payment. They will refinance it based on its appraised value and not on a purchase price. It's really nice to be able to do that. And a lot of times my contracts for deed will have a balloon in them. In other words, the contract is like for 5 years, and within a 5-year period, you're going to have to refinance out. But it's so much easier to refinance out than it is to get a purchase money mortgage at the get-go. So it allows for you to get some financing, some temporary financing in there.
I think some of these strategies, as I look back on these, I hadn't thought about this in a long time, but a lot of these strategies I did very early on, before private money, before I was established and could go in. I could have always gotten a loan. It just would have been harder.
Right.
So these were strategies that allowed me to buy property in the early years, and with little to no money of my own. And it worked out very well. There was a lot of that going on 20 years ago. A lot of it.
Oh, absolutely. And I did the same thing. And it was interesting that you said your deal was an investor. You bought the property from an investor. And that goes back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, that these types of deals were more common with investors. They knew, right? They knew how to put these types of deals together, and it was investor selling to investor a lot of times, right? And so any of you who want to move into small multifamilies, and by small multifamilies, I'm saying like 10 units or less, this is a very, very good way to buy the property, okay, and not have to get any financing on it. Just get the seller to finance it with a contract for deed. And they're happy to do that in a lot of cases.
Yeah. Now this is, as I look back on it, the other thing, if you're looking at this from the other side of the equation, is the investor's name was Bruce. Bruce made the original purchase. He marked it up to me as a wholesale deal. I bought it as a wholesale from a wholesaler. He was a wholesaler. Mm-hmm. And then he made money monthly on the note. So for him, it was a way to make more money than just to wholesale it for cash. He got his money, a lot of it later, but it was
absolutely.
It was a good strategy for him.
But yeah, and that's the thing, and that's why we call them creative strategies, right? Because he made money when he marked the property up. Okay. He also made money because I'm sure he was charging you interest on that contract. Okay. So he did that. And then he had a monthly spread on the cash flow, depending on how he had the property financed. So if there was an underlying mortgage, if he had an underlying loan on that property, I'm sure the payments that you were making to him, were more than the payments that he was making on the property. So we got a cash flow spread. So it's a win-win for everybody. And you're looking at it and say, I got a good deal. And the reason I got this as a good deal is because I didn't have to go to the bank. Mm-hmm. I didn't have to worry about loans going on my credit. Okay. I didn't have to worry about the number of properties I had, because you know as well as I, as a buyer, as an investor, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes we hit that max loan and they say, sorry, we can't finance any more properties for you because you got too many in your name, right? This is a way that you can get around that. Yes. So it's really good for everybody. I love creative strategies.
So we've covered 4 of the 5. So on the buy side, the order in which you would do these would be subject to the underlying loan, a wrap or a second, contract for deed, lease and an option. We haven't covered that one. So number 4 is lease and option.
Yep. And notice that I'm going down in my level of ownership, right? So with a sub 2 or a wrap, I actually get the deed. With a contract for deed, I get equitable interest, but I don't get the deed until I finish. And this next one that we're talking about is the old lease and option strategy, which I will tell you, people use it all the time, right? So of course, this is basically, you talk to the seller and you say, hey, look, lease me the property. I'm looking for something that I can lease for a few years and buy down the road. That's my thing to the seller a lot of times, right? Especially if it's an investor who is selling a rental property, right? They totally understand what you're saying. You say, hey, I'm looking for something I can rent, and then like 24 to 36 months, I'll cash you out.
Yep.
Okay. So you have two contracts. You have the lease agreement, and always make sure that you get the right to sublet. Okay, because you ain't going to live in it. Okay, so you have a lease agreement with the right to sublet, so you can put your own tenant in there. And then secondly, you have an option to purchase. Okay, and I usually get an option at whatever price the seller wants to sell at. Okay, and then I'll usually run it for 24 to 36 months with the seller. And then if I put a tenant in the property, which I'm going to, if they want to possibly buy the property, then I'll have a contract with them for like 12 months. So that if they choose not to exercise their contract, then I still have more time with my seller to negotiate or find another buyer or something like that.
Right.
Okay. But you just, the difference is that I do not have legal title to the property. So I can't say that it's my property because I'm just leasing it, right? With the right to sublet. So I don't have legal title, and that's why it's lower in my hierarchy, but I have control. And you can make a lot of money on properties that you don't necessarily own, but you control.
Okay.
Okay. So I do that a lot with single family stuff. And, here's an interesting concept. Right now, that strategy works really, really well because when you're talking to the seller, things are uncertain for them as well. They don't know what's going on. They don't want to get stuck in a, maybe a 5-year contract for deed they might could live with, but a 25-year mortgage or a 30-year mortgage, that just kind of blows their mind because nobody knows what the situation is right now. Okay. So I've had sellers that I talk to them and I'd say, hey, look, totally understand. I know where you're coming from. I don't know what the heck is going on right now either. So what if I rent the property, take care of all the maintenance, et cetera, and then in 24 to 36 months when all this COVID crap is over, I'll cash you out at your full asking price. Okay. They like that because they're thinking to themselves, okay, COVID will be over by then. We'll kind of know a little bit more about what's going on, right? I'm not having to make a permanent decision right now. Okay. So they like that flexibility. So if you run into a situation when you're talking to sellers and they don't want to make a move because of COVID, I've found this strategy works really, really well with them because they're getting some cash flow on their property. They're getting the property paid for, the mortgage loans paid for, stuff like that. But they're not having to make that final decision and be locked in to something that's going to last them for what they consider to be forever type thing.
And it's a solution they can live with.
Absolutely. And that just happened when I was talking to a seller one day. I kept hearing, and sometimes you have to listen to those sellers, right? And it wasn't that they didn't want to sell the property. It wasn't that they didn't want to sell it to me. It was that they were concerned because they didn't know what was going to happen, right? They didn't want to make a decision that was going to be long-term because they did not know what was going to happen right now. So I got to think, I said, okay, so it sounds like they just don't want a long-term decision. Let's give them something a little shorter. And they love the idea. And I said, okay, maybe this is a nice way to implement this strategy during that time period. Now, we can use lease and option with single family, right? Works real well and it's in my hierarchy, okay? But you know me, I love what I call a master lease option. You can do this with anything you can put a lease on. Okay, so I will lease multifamily properties and get an option on those using the same type of strategy, right? Works the same way. I call it a sandwich lease option on steroids, right? Because you've got more control. Let's say you do a 10, 15, 20 unit apartment complex, right? Not a real big one because you're not going to be able to do this on, well, you could, but it's harder to negotiate with the owners of 200, 300, 400 units for a master lease option deal. But the mom and pops who want to sell their property or they're tired of owning these particular properties, master lease and option can sometimes be exactly what they need. So you can use the lease option strategy with multifamily as well.
Sounds good. So then we're down to the very last one, which is a good
Cash.
one.
Oh,
Cash.
Lord, Kara, you know me. And you see why it's at the bottom of my hierarchy? Because Bill don't spend his own cash if he can help it. Okay. So in my world, cash does not mean Bill's cash. Okay. Cash can mean buyer cash. So let's say that I happen to have a buyer already in mind for a particular property, right? I can use their money for a down payment if I have to use cash. I can use private money. I love private money. You and I have talked about this. If I can get private money, I'm going to use private money. You can get private money to fund a down payment. You can get private money to fund the entire deal, right? If you wanted to pay all cash. Okay. And that's, everybody says cash is king, and it is. If you've got access to private money, okay, then you can go in with an all cash offer. And a lot of times your all cash offer can be much less than what you offer with a subject to, or with a wrap, or with a contract for deed. Usually those offers are at close to seller asking price, because you know the old rule, right? Your price, my terms. Okay. Your terms, which to the seller is usually cash, then it's going to be my price, and I'm going to negotiate it, right? So cash, if I'm going to buy all cash, a lot of people think this is blasphemy, but I'll even use hard money sometimes if the numbers work. Okay, there is nothing wrong with using hard money to fund a deal if your numbers work, right? So to me, and you know me, I'm a numbers guy. Okay, I run the numbers, and if the numbers work and I want to do the deal, I'll do the deal with hard money. I don't prefer it because, hard money rates are much higher than what I would pay with my normal private money, right? But it's all a matter of the numbers working first. And then if the numbers work first, then it's a matter of, am I willing to actually pay a hard money lender to do this deal? So how badly do I want the deal? Will my profit be lower? Yeah, maybe. Okay. But real estate, I mean, a profit's profit.
Yeah. So so you've laid that out very well as far as your buying criteria. You want what's best for Bill, and you don't want to pay cash. That's on the tail end. Now, what about when you go to sell? You flip-flop that entire model, correct?
I absolutely flip-flop. Now, you noticed on the buy side, and I alluded to this before, as I go down my hierarchy, I have less control, kind of, sort of, until I get down to the cash amount, and I just throw that at the bottom because I don't want to spend cash. But, it's starting at the very top, I get the deed. Okay. Even with a wrap, I get the deed. With a contract for deed, I've got equitable interest, and everybody knows it. And then the last, non-cash deal is the lease and option type deal, where I only control the property, but I have no ownership of that property. Okay. That's the hierarchy. Now, when I'm selling, it's the exact opposite, because I don't want my buyer to have a lot of control. I want to still, have the bulk of the control of that deal. Now, totally my favorite way to sell is all cash. Okay.
That's everybody's favorite one.
Yeah, that's the favorite way to sell, because I don't have to actually, do anything with the property. Get all cash and maybe it's done, right? And I don't have to worry about any more. Okay. But those non-cash type transactions, like we talked about before, the lease and option, contract for deed, the wrap, the subject to, okay, I have an entirely upside down, so to speak, hierarchy. Okay. So if I can't sell with all cash, I'll start out with a lease and option. And a lot of people say, why in the world do you want to start out with a lease and option? Well, I want to make sure my buyer is going to pay me. And if my buyer is not going to pay me, I want the easiest way to be able to get them out of the property. And a lease is the easiest way, right? You just evict them, except now in COVID where you can't evict anybody, but I digress. So I go lease and option, then I go contract for deed. I will sell on a wrap sometimes. Usually I will with a lot more screening of the buyer, and usually the higher end properties, like a property I sold in Nashville. I'd gotten it sub 2. I sold it with a wrap and transferred the deed to them because I knew they were going to pay for the property, right? It's a higher end property. Lower end properties, unfortunately, those are the ones where people can't always make the payments. They get behind. So with those lower end properties, I like to stop at contract for deed. I don't like to transfer the deed until they're ready to actually pay off my contract.
Yeah.
But that's my hierarchy for selling.
Yeah, and subject to, it's still kind of risky unless you set up an escrow or something. That would be my least favorite way to sell, would be subject to the existing mortgage, because that mortgage would be in my name.
Absolutely. And see, here's the thing. If you're selling subject to the existing mortgage, it's just like the sellers on our end, right? When we're buying sub 2, the buyer, our buyer, would have control of that property once they got the deed. They can do anything they want to with it.
Yeah.
So, I try to like to do a little CYA, right? And stop at the contract for deed, which gives them equitable interest. But if they don't make their payments, it's a whole lot easier. Not saying totally easy, because you would still have to either foreclose or evict them, right? But it's a whole lot easier to control and stay on top of things when that deed is still in your name and you are still the legal owner of the property.
Right.
Okay.
So, well, let's talk about trust at this point. How do trusts fit into creative strategies?
Well, me, I love good trust, right? I use a trust generally whenever I intend to hold a property. Now, I don't think you need a trust for a wholesale deal. I don't think you need a trust for a property you're going to turn around and sell for cash, something like that. Okay. But if you're going to hold that property for any length of time, or if you're going to take a mortgage back on that property, or if you're going to do a contract for deed on that property, I like for that property to go into a trust or take it in a trust. Okay. Because it shows a lot of privacy on your part. And with a trust, it is a lot easier. There are a lot of different ways that you can sell. For instance, you can take the property in a trust, and instead of selling the property itself, you sell the beneficial interest of the trust, right? It also is very, very helpful, especially with a sub 2 deal, right? Because whenever you take a property subject to, if a property is transferred, this includes with a wrap mortgage as well, that most loans these days have a due on sale clause, okay? And any change of ownership could, not necessarily will, but could cause that loan to be called in under the DOS clause. Now, everybody don't get too concerned. I've not ever had that happen in my 3 decades of investing. So it's very unlikely, especially if the payments are being made, but there's always the chance. And that chance is reduced or mitigated if you take the property in a trust.
Yeah. To your point, it was probably about 10 or 12 years ago, I had a property subject to the existing mortgage. And it was during a time when I actually decided the interest rates had gone down somewhat, and I could get a lower interest rate than was actually on the property at that time. So I went to the bank and said, I've got this property. The real estate market wasn't great then, but it was not real bad either. And I just said, I've been making the payments on this property for 2 years. And I just told them what I did. I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose. I can always go over here and refinance if I have to. Mm-hmm. But I talked to them. They were a big mortgage company, and they determined that this seller had a 100% financed VA loan. So I was going to have to come up with money to even refinance through them. I was going to have to come up with a regular down payment. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. So I just looked at him and said, so you're going to call the loan? He went, no, you're good. Mm-hmm. That was the end of it. Was, I knew that worst case scenario, I could refi out, but I thought at that time, maybe I could just convert it somehow into my own loan, but no, they weren't having that because it was 100% finance VA loan. It was one that I'd bought on terms. They actually gave it to me. They just said, here, we're getting a divorce.
Right.
So
I actually had a client who bought a property subject to, and a few years down the road, the seller got a little antagonistic and said, well, I don't want this property in my name anymore. I don't want this loan in my name. I want off of this loan.
Yeah.
Right. Type thing. The seller went to the bank and told the bank that she had sold the property. And the bank looked back at the payment history and said, so?
Yeah.
So because the payments had been made, and they refused to take her off the loan, but they wouldn't call the loan, which I thought was really, really interesting. Because that may not have happened all the time, but with this particular bank, it did.
This was a strange deal because now that you mentioned that, he eventually remarried a few years down the road. So I just kept this property and kept the loan, just went about my business. And he got remarried, and I got a call from his new mortgage company. He told them what he had done, and all they required from me was the proof that I was making the payments.
Yep, and they wanted that to be able to offset that against the loan for his DTI because he wanted to buy another property.
He wanted to buy another property.
Sure.
So that was, looking back on it, that was a kind of a strange deal, but it didn't all happen at one time. So we just, that's proof that these don't generally cause any problems.
Yeah. And again, it's all about understanding how creative strategies work, how trusts work, how loans work when you transfer the deed and when you don't transfer the deed. And if you have an understanding of that, you can usually get things to work in your favor. Not all the time. I mean, I've heard of places. Now, what's interesting is I have heard, right, that loans have been called, but I can't find anybody that's actually happened to.
Right.
Whenever anybody says that it's happened, well, did it happen to you? No, but so-and-so told me it happened to them. And I'm thinking, okay, I would love to find that so-and-so and ask them what they did, because 9 times out of 10, it's something stupid that happened. Oh, I will give you one example that I did know, that I did hear about, that did come up. Okay. A friend of mine, not a client, but a friend of mine was taking a property subject to, and the seller called the bank and asked if they could do it. Okay. Now, what is the bank going to say?
No.
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 Okay. So they're going to tell you can't do it. This is one situation where forgiveness is always easier, is better to get them permission. But anyway, the bank said they couldn't do it. Seller did it anyway. Well, as soon as the bank saw the change in insurance, okay, and the change in the property taxes, because that's usually how they find out. There's nobody sitting at the clerk's office waiting for deeds to be changed, right? They find out because the insurance changes or because the taxes change, right? So as soon as they found out, they called the loan due. And somebody mentioned, said, well, Bill, you said it's never happened. Well, that's because nobody made the stupid mistake of calling the seller. When the bank tells you not to do it, what do you think they're going to do if they find out you did? Right? It's like slapping them in the face. So of course they're going to call that loan due. But what they actually did was let my buddy assume the loan.
Yeah.
Which is unusual. So they were happy that he was making the payments, but they were really pissed off because that seller asked if he could transfer the property. They told him no.
Yeah.
Right. So don't ever call the seller and ask them, or call the bank and ask them if you can do it, because they're not going to say yes.
Yeah, that's for sure. So a few years ago, DoddFrank was a huge issue in the investment world.
Yes.
I know some things have changed, some things are still in place. So what effect does Dodd-Frank have on all of this?
Yeah, that really tried to kick the creative strategies to the road, because it everybody said, oh my gosh, seller financing is over with. Okay. Well, it's not. You can still do seller financing. We were just limited in the way that we could do it. Okay. Dodd-Frank is still there. Everybody says, well, with when Trump took office, he said he was getting rid of Dodd-Frank. Well, we all know that he made changes to Dodd-Frank. Unfortunately, the changes that he made affected institutions. It did not affect the small guy like us investors.
Yeah.
Right. So the changes that were made to Dodd-Frank didn't help us a bit. Okay. So the old rule about, well, if you do more than 3 transactions a year, you need to use a registered mortgage loan originator, blah, blah, blah. That is still there. That is still in place. Okay. But the thing about Dodd-Frank and when you're being creative is that you need to structure your deals so that they fall outside of Dodd-Frank and don't fall under the rules and regs at all, or whether you stay within the rules and regs and you comply and still don't have to, which means you got to stay within that 1 deal rule or the 3 deal rule, right? So as investors, if we're selling to an investor, we don't have to worry about Dodd-Frank issues. If you're buying, you don't have to worry about Dodd-Frank anyway. Okay, because you're on the buy side. So, and interestingly enough, somebody says, well, what about that poor seller? Well, 9 times out of 10, that poor seller, that's his only property. He lives in it, right? If we're doing single family homes, he lives in the property. So he's not going to sell another property anyway. So he's going to be excluded from Dodd-Frank, right? So it's not going to matter to him. It's going to matter to you when you sell because you're doing a lot of these deals. Okay. So there are some ways that you can mitigate the problems of Dodd-Frank. I didn't mention it when we talked about trusts, but using a trust to buy your property is a way to mitigate the Dodd-Frank rules and stay in compliance and still not have to use a mortgage loan originator.
I know one investor that does a lot of deals, and he went ahead and just aligned himself with a residential mortgage loan originator, and it allowed his business to move forward seamlessly. But that's not something that most of us would have to do. He was doing a lot of deals and a lot of seller financing.
Right. So and like you said, that's not going to affect most of us.
Yeah.
If you're talking about the guy I think you're talking about, that's his main focus. He buys and sells, buys and sells, buys and sells with owner financing.
Yeah.
And if you're doing that, you pretty much going to need to use a mortgage loan originator because you're talking about multiple deals a year.
Right.
But let's say that you are the average investor like you are and like I are. We'll do a mixture of types of transactions during the year, right? And we might only do 6 owner finance deals, right? So we think, well, 6 deals and I'm not associated with the mortgage loan originator, right? But to be in compliance, unless you structure the deals the way to be excluded, you would have to have a mortgage loan originator for just 6 deals, right? So I think it's more important for us who don't do multiple owner finance deals during the year to know and understand more the rules of how to structure our deals so that we're excluded from it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And guys, for any of you all that would like to have a copy of Bill's, I call it a cheat sheet. What do you call it, Bill?
Yeah, I call it a sheet too, but it's going to have the list of the hierarchy, right? And maybe a little bit about each one, here and there, just maybe defining it. But I'll have that available for the guys to get as a download.
Okay, and where can they get that?
They can get that at billwalston.com hierarchy.
And I'll put that link in there for everybody that would have to look up the spelling of hierarchy.
That's true. Sharon, guys, I'm sorry. Sharon told me, says, can't you come up with a better name? And I couldn't.
No, it's just one of those things. They'll be Googling hierarchy. So.
Hey, no, it's more like, Siri, how do you spell hierarchy?
Well, Bill, this has been a great show. So they can reach you then at billwalston.com. But one more thing I wanted to mention is that I know that you've got a workshop coming up in January.
Yep, I do.
So let's talk about that a little bit. We're not going to give you the exact dates and the exact details, so you're going to have to stay tuned for that. But you're going to want to hear about this.
Yeah, it's coming up in a few weeks. It is all about private money, right? Because that's one of my strategies. And a lot of people don't understand how to approach that. They don't understand what it is, who they can borrow from, how the money can be used once they borrow it, where the money is going to come from their friends who might want to invest with them. I mean, I'll tell you, Sharon, there are a lot of people who will come up to you, and I'm sure you've had some of these too, says, oh my gosh, I've always wanted to invest in real estate. I'd love to do what you're doing, but I just don't have time. I just don't know how, stuff like that. Well, guess what? You know, I invest in a lot of deals, and sometimes I allow people to invest with me. Is that something you might be interested in? Okay, that's how you can find a private lender, guys. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in my workshop. The workshop is going to be called First Steps to Private Money. What an original title. What an original title, right?
But I like titles that are to the point and people know what they're getting. Yep. So first steps to
private money. And basically what it's going to do is, hey, I'm a real estate investor. I've never used private money to get my deals. Okay, how would I get started in that? What are the steps that I need to take to make sure that I'm talking to people correctly, that I'm not, doing anything that's illegal, and the proper procedures that they need to go through in order to get to that first private lender.
Okay, that's going to be an excellent workshop. So I will also send out a link for it too when the time comes. So reach out to Bill at billwalston.com and to get his handout on the hierarchy of how he does it, which is a very good way to think about this. So it's billwalston.com/hierarchy. Well, Bill, thanks again for coming on the show and sharing your knowledge and your story.
I enjoy being on your show anytime, Sharon.
Okay. And thanks to all the listeners too who come and show up week after week. And please share this show and leave us a rating and review on iTunes. I would really appreciate it. And I will see you all same time, same place next week. Bye for now.
See ya.